Hi, my name is Tod Bolsinger of the Dupree Center Church Leadership Initiative. I'm here to talk to you about adaptive leadership. And this presentation is called How Not to Waste a Crisis. It was March 13th, 2020. I remember because it was Friday the 13th. And I had just finished a presentation in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, talking to a group of church planters who were eager to go into their world and to bring the gospel into the different communities that they found themselves. I finished my presentation. We all said goodbye. I headed off to the Sioux Falls airport to fly back to Los Angeles. By the time I got back to Los Angeles, the world had completely changed. For me, the moment that I knew that it changed was en route. It was when I went through the Denver airport and United Airlines handed me a Clorox wipe. They told me that because of this thing called the coronavirus, they were unsure whether their usual safety methods of disinfecting planes could work, and they encouraged us to take an extra wipe just to feel extra safe and wipe down our own seats. It struck me that if an airline that is used to keeping people safe while flying 30,000 feet in the air was now scared of this new virus, the world really had changed. By the time I got home and I got into what would be the last lift that I would take in 2020, my phone blew up and I realized that everything was changing for our work. I was a senior administrator at Fuller Seminary at the time. I had 60 staff who were embedded all over the country. We mostly worked on serving churches and organizations by taking the resources of our seminary and making them available to people. Some of us taught as professors, most of us were staff people, all of us were deeply committed to our work. And I learned while I was checking my phone that we were going to be completely online as an institution for the spring quarter. That wasn't a big deal. We're pretty used to that. That we'd have to work remotely. That was more of a disruption, but many of our people already were. And here was the big one. We wouldn't be able to travel. Not travel, I thought to myself when I'd first heard about it. How are we possibly going to be able to serve people in the different churches and locations they find themselves in if we're not going to be able to travel? I travel 100,000 miles a year. At least I did before 2020. That was a huge disruption. But because of what had happened in the previous few days, I was ready for it. So I sent back an email to my boss, the president of the seminary, and said that I'd have our division ready to go. And we began to put in place the changes that would then become standard operating procedure for most organizations around the world during this pandemic called the coronavirus. One of the things that helped me to prepare is that on Tuesday, we'd been given a presentation in the President's Council from our coronavirus task force. And I have to admit that as a person who leads change and is the change management guy of the school and is the change leadership person for many churches, I was the most resistant to change. It was disruptive to me, this whole idea that we couldn't travel. How could I possibly fulfill my work and my ministry? But by the time we got to Friday, and I'm wiping off my seat with a Clorox wipe, and I'm getting emails and text messages on my phone in a lift from Los Angeles back to my home, I was ready for the change because something had happened during the week. Between Tuesday and Friday, not only had I heard the news reports about the changes happening in the world, like the NBA canceling its season and March Madness being canceled for the basketball tournament for the NCAA, and schools closing and Costco running out of toilet paper. But even more for me, what happened is I had a chance to talk to some people who were already living in the future. And that was critical. When you're trying to lead change, you need trustworthy guides to help lead you through, especially guides who can admit that there is no expertise, that there's no perfect plan to follow, but that they are already beginning to live into the future and learn from it. I have a son who lives in Seattle, Washington. His girlfriend is a social worker in convalescent homes. He had said to me, "Dad, this is serious. You need to take it seriously. None of us know exactly what to do, but we know we need to be safe." My brother was living in northern Italy. They'd already been in lockdown. I remember texting him and saying, "You're in lockdown. What does that mean?" And his response was, "Look, we didn't take this very seriously when it first came out. But now we're taking it really seriously. You need to prepare for this, Todd." And one of my students, who is an Episcopal priest in New York City, canceled their services on March 15th, as many churches, almost every church I knew around the country did. They did a comp-line service that evening on Facebook, and I joined with that service from California. And I heard people pray for people who had COVID by name. These voices from the future, not experts who knew exactly what to do, but trustworthy guides, were what I needed to begin to prepare my school, my organization, and the people that I worked with for change. What I want to talk about in this presentation is how we live in a world of constant change. The change is happening more rapidly than ever, and it takes a different kind of leadership than most of us have been trained for. One of my mentors likes to tell the story about his spiritual director, who was a Catholic priest, whose brother was a Marine Corps jet fighter pilot. The jet fighter pilot and the priest met up one day on the base so that the pilot could give the priest a birthday present, an opportunity to spend some time in a flight simulator and learn the experience of what his brother, the pilot, experienced every day in these expensive jet planes. When they finished in the flight simulator, the priest, who's a spiritual director and likes asking questions, asked a question to the person training. He said, why do you guys train using flight simulators? And his answer was, at the moment of crisis, you will not rise to the occasion. You will default to your training. Dear friends, most of us were not trained for a world that has such amazing amounts of disruption, such rapid change, such disorientation. Most of us were trained for a world that was very predictable. For 1,700 years, the church functioned under a mental model called Christendom, where at least in the West, we knew that the church was a part of culture and supported by culture and was important to culture. And while that has changed dramatically in the last generation, so that most of us have already begun to realize that we need to lead differently than past generations, that was sped up on March 13th, 2020. Now we find ourselves needing to figure out how to navigate and change and lead in a world that some people have said is like 1918, 1929, and 1968 all at the same time. We have a health pandemic, a global recession, and social uprisings all happening at one time. And nobody has ever had to lead a congregation through an experience like this. So what do you do? What do you do when, even if you have a master of divinity, you don't have any mastery of the moment? What do you do when you have to lead a group of people who are looking you in the eye and saying, what do you think we should do? And the only honest answer is, I don't know. It takes a different, new kind of leadership. Ronald Heifetz of Harvard University wrote about adaptive leadership. Adaptive leadership is what's called for at that moment when we are no longer experts. Adaptive leadership is the kind of leadership that is required of us when we have to lean into a new day where there are no best practices and that there are no experts who can tell you what to do. You might have some guides and some friends and some partners that are really important, but there is no surefire solution. What Heifetz says is when you find yourself in a crisis, realize that there are two phases. The first phase he calls the acute phase. Ronald Heifetz was a medical doctor before he was a professor of leadership. And he uses the example of the emergency room. When a person goes through an emergency and they're rushed into the emergency room, all the people gather around. They're going to stabilize, protect, buy time, keep the patient alive. It's what my friend Andy Crouch and his partners called a blizzard mentality. We're going to hunker down and get through this. It'll be a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, but we will get through. And every organization that has been disrupted in this last year understands this experience. Every congregation has been through this, some of us multiple times. The acute phase is where we just try to stabilize, protect, buy time, survive. If you've ever spent any time in an emergency room, you know that very quickly when you start feeling better, all you want to do is get out. You want to go home. You want them to give you back your clothes and send you off with a prescription, and you want to just get back to normal as quick as possible. But what Heifetz says is that the wise leader understands that if we've been thrown into a crisis, even into an acute phase, that what we should do is resist the temptation to want to get back to normal and instead use this crisis in what he calls the adaptive phase. The adaptive phase is the opportunity that we have to address underlying issues that we've not had the will to confront before the crisis. It's what Andy Crouch calls the ice age mentality. If this storm is actually just a signal that we've got a bigger change happening How can we prepare for that? Heifetz says, adaptive leadership seizes the opportunity of moments like this to hit the organizational reset button. And wherever you are in the country, in whatever context you're in, there's a moment here that we will have in 2020 and 2021 and maybe 2022 to begin to look deeply at how this crisis has disrupted things of the past and allows us to address some deeper underlying issues. Remember, the great temptation is to want to go back to what's familiar, to just go back to the way it was or the way we wish it was. Remember, when people think of the word familiar, think of how that is the same root word as the word family. It means that when we're in unfamiliar territory, we feel like we're homeless. We just want to get back to what is familiar, to what makes us feel like we're at home. Even if that home was dysfunctional, and even if that home wasn't working very well. The adaptive leader takes advantage of this moment to address those underlying issues with a different kind of leadership. You survive the acute stage by coming together through wise relational support, by being a community that cares for each other. And if you're a leader in an acute stage, then this is a good moment for you to double down on partners and mentors and friends, getting support for you as you go through this crisis and take your congregation through the crisis. But resist the temptation to want to go back to normal. Instead, take the congregation into the adaptive stage. In the adaptive stage, you have to use adaptive capacity, the capacity to learn, to face losses, and to navigate competing values to address the underlying issues that keep you from fulfilling your mission in a changing world. The adaptive stage is where you want to find yourself in. So here's one way to think about it. What are the underlying conditions that are being revealed in your organization? You've heard that phrase, right? We've used it a lot during the pandemic. Underlying conditions are the conditions of a human body that make it more susceptible to the coronavirus. So if you've got diabetes or neuropathy or obesity or heart disease, you're in much more danger than a body that is more healthy. So let the coronavirus be apocalyptic. What has it revealed about your congregation? What are some of the underlying conditions that have been that you've discovered in this moment that maybe now you could have the will to address through adaptive capacity? Here are 4 that come up whenever I talk about this. A lack of deep discipleship for a persevering church. The Sunday show, as one pastor called it, is just not doing enough to sanctify the saints. A lack of deep community that keeps people connected and unified in times of disconnection and division. When people can change membership as easy as clicking on a mouse, you know we're in a deeply disconnected world. A lack of extensive leadership capacity for distributed models of ministry. If we might go through seasons of where we are able to gather and then unable to gather and coming together and not going together, what would it take for us to have the leadership capacity to be able to lead our church deeply and more faithfully in our mission, even if we are not able to gather together in our sanctuaries or be together in larger groups? We're going to need more leaders with more capacity, more distributed across the miles and the contexts. And lastly, many of us acknowledge that the church is unable to wisely and courageously speak prophetically, collaborate for justice, serve the common good, because we've been shaped through this cultural privilege of 1,700 years of Christendom world. We have lost some of our prophetic voice. So what's it going to require of you? A different way of leading. Ed Friedman puts it this way. When any relationship system is imaginatively gridlocked, it cannot get free simply through more thinking about the problem. Conceptually stuck systems cannot be unstuck simply by trying harder. For a fundamental reorientation to occur, that spirit of adventure, which optimizes serendipity and which enables new perceptions beyond the control of our thinking processes, must happen first. If you get nothing out of this presentation, please hear this. If you feel as if you're stuck, you're not going to get out of it by trying harder. That's like paddling harder in a river where there isn't any water. You'll just exhaust yourself and not get any farther. You can't get through this problem by trying what you used to do harder. You need a different way of thinking that comes out of a different way of approaching the problem that leads to some different strategies. What Friedman calls a spirit of adventure. What is that? It's acknowledging that our solution is going to require learning and it's going to result in facing loss. The key to adaptive capacity is to lead people through learning. What do we learn as we experiment together, grow together, trust each other? What new insights can we learn in this new day that we can apply to our mission? And then we have to be willing to face loss. In the book Canoeing the Mountains, I told the story of Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery, who expected to find a water route that would connect all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They brought their own canoes that they had built with their own hands. But when they found themselves facing the Rocky Mountains, they recognized they couldn't canoe through the mountains. They'd have to drop the canoe, learn, listen to other people, and face the loss of status, of expertise, of certainty, and yes, even some of the things that they built with their own hands. Adaptive change requires that kind of shift. This comes from Ronald Heifetz, where he talks about technical problems that experts can solve and adaptive challenges that cannot be solved. And notice how he talks about this. If a technical problem is the application of current knowledge, skills, and tools to resolve a situation, the work of an expert, adaptive challenges can't be solved with that work of an expert, but they require people to make a shift in values, expectations, attitudes, or habits of behavior. Shifting. How easily do people shift values, expectations, attitudes, or habits of behavior? And how do we know that we're shifting the right things and are being committed to not shifting the most important things? This is the challenge of an adaptive capacity. So here's how we know that we have adaptive challenges. They're a lot like the spirit of adventure. They require learning. They result in facing loss. And they reveal gaps, underlying conditions, underlying issues, gaps in behavior, values, or strategies that must be negotiated. One thing that you can do to begin to lean into adaptive challenges is to remember the story of Sacagawea. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark stepped over the Lemhi Pass, facing the Rocky Mountains, and were lost. They knew less about the American West, Dayton Duncan said, than Neil Armstrong knew about the moon. Neil Armstrong had seen pictures of the moon. But they had with them a voice, a dispatch from the future, a person who hadn't been trained for canoes, but had been trained in the mountains. As my friend Dave Gibbons says, the future is already here. It's just on the margins. And part of what adaptive leadership requires us to do is to no longer look for the old experts, but to look for a people who have experience in this new world and bring them into partnership with us that we might learn from them. And for some of us, this loss of status alone will be a giant change. Eric Hoffer says, in times of great change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. Let me challenge you, dear friends, to become learners. Adaptive leaders are learners. Learn as you go, face the losses, address the underlying issues, and discover the whole new world in front of you. The opportunity that is unfolding if you refuse to go back, but instead lead into uncharted territory. And God bless you as you do.